This evening's lecture, the W.H. Bryan Jr. Family Lecture, is named in gratitude for a special family from Amarillo, Texas, who have been wonderful friends and encouragers of Baylor and the work of the Institute for Faith and Learning. I'd like to recognize members of that family, Bill Bryan and Linda Bryan, both Baylor alums. Bill, a former member of the Board of Regents, Linda, a present member of the Board of Regents. Bill and Linda, will you all stand and please let us join in our gratitude. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Professor Margaret Somerville, someone uniquely gifted to speak to the concerns of our symposium from the intersection of medicine, ethics, and law. With degrees in pharmacy, law, and a PhD, Margaret Somerville teaches at McGill University in Montreal, Canada. She is the founding director of the McGill Center for Medicine, Ethics, and Law and holds 2 professorships, one in the Faculty of Law as the Samuel Gale Professor of Law and another in the Faculty of Medicine. A recipient of the Order of Australia and elected a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, she was named the first recipient of the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization's Avicenna Prize for Ethics in Science. Professor Somerville has been active worldwide as a speaker, consultant, and researcher on topics such as euthanasia, reproductive technologies, mental health, human rights and health care, the pharmaceutical industry, AIDS, abortion, and the role that scientific and medical research and technology play in the formation of societal values. She's also consulted for international organizations such as the Global Program on AIDS of the World Health Organization, the United Nations Human Rights Commission in Geneva, and law reform commissions in Canada and Australia. She has been honored in Canada by being selected to deliver in 2006 the prestigious Massey Lectures, a series of 5 lectures delivered to large audiences across the country and then broadcast on CBC Radio. Professor Somerville joins the likes of John Kenneth Galbraith, Martin Luther King Jr., Jean Vanier, and Charles Taylor as Massey Lecturers. Her Massey Lectures have been recently published with the title, The Ethical Imagination, Journeys of the Human Spirit. Professor Somerville's presentation this evening is titled, Is Dignity a Useful, Useless, or Dangerous Concept? Please join me in welcoming Margaret Somerville.
Thank you, and it's a great pleasure to be here and lovely to be in Texas. Mr. President, Judge Starr, Dr. Davis, ladies and gentlemen. So, is dignity a useful, useless, or dangerous concept? The lawyer's answer is that depends. You know, lawyers. And that's one of the things that I am. It depends on what we mean by human dignity, and there's no consensus. How we use the concept, again, there's no consensus. What we see as its basis, in particular, whether it's secular or religious or both, and again, there's no consensus. As to the dangers, there's a saying in human rights, nowhere are human rights more threatened than when we act purporting to do only good. The reason is that the good that we hope to do blinds us to the harms that sometimes inevitably we also have to do. And respect for human dignity is overwhelmingly perceived as doing only good. So that raises the question, are there some accompanying harms that we're overlooking? And if so, what are they? Now, what I want to do now is just run you very quickly through some international declarations that use the word dignity. Don't worry that you can't read everything that's on these slides, because I really just want to give you an impression of what we're dealing with. And so the first of the international instruments, and probably the most important one, is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So here's the Universal Declaration. And what that tells us, what I've done is every time they've mentioned the word dignity, I've put it in red. So it tells us dignity is foundational and all people have equal rights. Dignity recognises all humans have worth and are equal. There are rights to the support needed to maintain dignity, and there are social and cultural rights, and dignity requires access to work and social assistance. So those are some of the things that dignity establishes in that. Then we can look at the UNESCO Declaration on Bioethics. This tells us that scientific advances can threaten dignity, and science must not contravene human dignity. As well as that, it tells us that we need to promote respect for dignity and to ensure respect for life, and that dignity and human rights of individuals are to be respected. Then we come to some further provisions. These tell us that it's prohibited to use culture as an excuse to infringe dignity. The sorts of things you could think of there would be, for example, female genital mutilation, and arguing, well, that's a cultural right, therefore that can be imposed. It says, no, you can't do that. And the Declaration gives no basis for infringing dignity. And here's a third declaration, another international declaration. It's the Universal Declaration on the Human Genome and Human Rights. And what this tells us is that we have to improve health, but we must respect dignity when we're trying to do that. As well, that the human genome, I hope this is right, the human genome shows our unity, our common heritage. Indeed, the human genome is often referred to as the common heritage of humankind that we have to hold on trust for future generations. It says dignity overrides genetic difference, and that there's no genetic reductionism. Genetic reductionism is what we see, for example, in Richard Dawkins' work. And some of the people who write in Sam Harris and Daniel Dennett, where what they argue is that we're nothing more than gene machines, that genes are us. But there's dignity overrides genetic difference. You can't have discrimination, and as well, that's the discrimination. And then here we have the respect for the dignity of research subjects, that's scientific and medical research, that dignity bans reproductive cloning, and as well, this is a bit far away, that research on the genome must respect dignity, and that defence of human dignity is required, and that we have to identify breaches of dignity and ban practices that could be contrary to human dignity. Now, you'll be glad that that's over. So what can we note from all of this? What I really wanted to show you was just how ubiquitous and how often that word dignity is used, and that's in our most important international instruments. So what we can find is that human dignity is nowhere defined in these instruments, that human dignity is distinguished from human rights and fundamental freedoms. What that means in the usual rule of interpretation of these kind of instruments is the rule against redundancy says if two different words are used when they could mean the same thing, then they are meant to mean different things. So what we have to ask is, what is it that different thing might be? Some interventions are expressly labelled as contrary to human dignity. For example, germline interventions and reproductive cloning of human beings. And what we could ask is, what's the basis for that labelling? And could knowing that help us to decide whether other interventions, actions or omissions are contrary to human dignity? As well, the sorts of things that lawyers look at in interpreting texts is that the order of human dignity, fundamental freedoms and human rights varies. They're not always in the same order. And so again, we have to ask, does that tell us anything? So in other words, what human dignity consists of, or what respect for it in general requires we do or don't do, is not spelled out in these documents. Now, Dr. Davis mentioned the report from the President's Council on Bioethics of the United States. It's an excellent report. I've seen, if you're really interested in dignity, I'd strongly recommend that you buy it. I've seen that it is on sale here by the bookstore. And so some of this first part of what I'm going to tell you is more or less a quick summary of some of the things that you could read about in much more detail in that report. Adam Schulman, who wrote the first chapter of it, focuses on the relation of dignity and human rights. And what he says is that the affirmations of human dignity reflect a political consensus among groups that may well have quite different beliefs about what human dignity means, where it comes from, and what it entails. In effect, human dignity serves as the placeholder for whatever it is about human beings that entitles them to basic human rights and freedoms. And that's something that's quite common in bioethics. That sometimes, and quite often, we can get agreement on how we should handle some bioethical problem, but we don't necessarily agree on the reasons why that is the way that we should handle it. And that seems to be true with respect to dignity. We all can agree, we can at least start from consensus that we agree that we've got to respect dignity. We might not agree on the reasons why we have to respect it, and sometimes we don't even agree on what it requires. As well, there's some quotes from the late Sergio Vieira de Mello, and he was a United Nations Special Representative in Iraq and prominent human rights advocate, and he described the relation of dignity and human rights this way. In the post-World War II years, the international community committed to a set of basic universal values: equality, dignity, tolerance, and non-discrimination, through the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So it's not clear whether he sees human rights as founding dignity or dignity as being the foundation that human rights are meant to implement. But one of your speakers in the next day, the physician ethicist Daniel Sulmazy, is very clear in this regard. He describes the relation of dignity and human rights this way: intrinsic dignity can be understood as the foundation of all human rights. We respect the rights of an individual because we first recognize his or her intrinsic dignity. We do not bestow dignity because we first bestow rights. In other words, dignity is primary and rights are the way in which we try to ensure that dignity. And I think that's very important that we understand that. Another way you could express that would be that human rights establish the conditions that are required in order to ensure that inherent human dignity is respected. So what I want to do now is just look quickly at how some commentators have defined dignity, despite the fact that we can't define it. The old definitions, it was associated with rank and status. It was the Greek concept of comparative dignity. And this changed in the 19th century with the spread of democracy and the Christian idea of equality, that therefore we had equal dignity. Democracy required that everyone could be seen as having dignity, but that didn't help us with the consensus on it. Political scientist Diana Schaub says that we no longer agree about the content of dignity because we no longer share what Mailander, another of your speakers here at this wonderful conference, what Mailander calls a vision of what it means to be human. And she's correct that the various interpretations of what it means to be human are at the core of our disagreements about the nature of dignity and what respect for it requires. And those disagreements are what I would like to explore this evening. Because of some of the international declarations we looked at show dignity is ubiquitous in bioethics, that was the reason that the President's Council on Bioethics undertook this investigation. And it was, as Dr. Davis said, because Ruth Macklin, who's a tough opponent, I've known her for years, she just comes out, and Ruth tends to say things very bluntly, and she said, well, dignity is a totally useless concept and it should be abandoned, and instead what we should use are concepts of respect for persons and respect for autonomy. So let's have a look at some of the essayists who contributed to trying to define dignity. One group of them connected dignity with morality. I find it particularly interesting from Holmes Rolston, he's an American philosopher, is that I hadn't thought about this before I read what he said, that we've got consciousness and animals have got consciousness. So what distinguishes us from animals? And in actual fact, that's a central question at the moment. It's the one that the president brought up, that I was asked, what did I think was the most dangerous idea in the world at the moment? And my answer was that there's no difference between humans and other animals or humans and robots. Because once you say that, then whatever we do to animals, we should be allowed to do to humans, and what we don't do to animals, we shouldn't do to humans. So, for example, Peter Singer at Princeton says, well, we don't eat humans, so we shouldn't eat animals. He's a vegetarian. And we do use euthanasia for animals, so therefore that means we should be allowed to have euthanasia for animals. So it's got very, very far-reaching implications if we accept that. And so what this philosopher says is that this has to do with the fact that we have an ethical and moral sense as humans, and that other animals don't have that. Now, in that regard, Wesley Smith, who's a lawyer who talks a lot about, surprisingly perhaps for some people, talks a lot about human dignity and a lot about bioethics. Starbucks had a program at one stage where they wanted to have good conversations in the coffee shops. So they asked a group of Americans to write a little saying that they could put on a coffee cup that was meant for people sitting in the coffee shop to start up a good conversation. And here's what Wesley Smith wrote. The morality of the 21st century will depend on how we respond to this simple but profound question. Does every human life have equal moral value simply and merely because it's human? Answer yes, and we have a chance of achieving universal human rights. Answer no, and it means that we're merely another animal in the forest. So it's a powerful warning that deciding about dignity is no insignificant issue or choice on our part. And then you can look at Charles Rubin, who says, well, this means that we're morally responsible. Again, it goes to moral responsibility. And Gilbert Mailander as well says, dignity is used to express moral concern or condemnation. So what you can say from that is that those commentators all think that dignity is connected with morality. So the next question that I asked myself was, well, if it's connected with morality, is it necessarily connected with religion? Because traditionally we've connected morality and religion. And many secular humanists argue that it is connected with religion, which is the reason that they label it as useless at best and dangerous at worst concept. But then we have to ask, but are they correct that it's necessarily a religious concept? Now, for example, Robert Cranach, who's a political science philosopher, says that human dignity is based on the mystery of the human soul. Now, most people regard soul as a theological concept, but what I'd like to suggest to you, and I don't know if some of you here might be shocked by some of the suggestions I'm going to make to you now, is that I'd like to suggest a broader concept linked to soul that might allow us to find a broader consensus about the values we should adopt if we are to respect human dignity. I've spoken about what I call the human spirit in my book, The Ethical Imagination, and its importance in dealing with ethical issues. And what I'd like to do is explain to you what I mean by the human spirit. I adopt a very broad definition of spirituality and regard it as a natural, inherent characteristic common to all humans, which some people express through religious belief and practice, and others express in secular ways. I won't go into it tonight, but I actually believe that there's a genetic base for spirituality, and I think we'll find that, which is not to say that religion is simply a genetic phenomenon. It's not. But I think we were going to learn some amazing things. I regard the genetic base, just very briefly, as being more like a radio or a television set. If you haven't got a radio, you can't hear a radio program. You haven't got a TV, you can't watch TV. But those instruments don't determine what it is that you receive through those instruments. And I think that perhaps that's going to be true for us with spirituality. And I call our capacity to experience that spirituality the human spirit. Our longing for transcendence, the need to feel that we belong to something larger than ourselves, and our search for meaning I see as an expression of the human spirit. And human spirit is a term that I use in a religiously neutral sense, so it's open to people who are not religious and to people who are religious, and if they're religious, no matter what their religion. In other words, a belief in the human spirit does not require a belief in the supernatural or any religious belief, but it is not antithetical to religious belief, and that's what's important. And what I'm trying to do here is build a base from which all people of goodwill can start to try to find some common ethics. In short, we can all agree that we have a human spirit, and having that shared starting point is very important in searching for some shared ethics in our contemporary, pluralistic, multicultural, multi-religious, secular societies. And here's how I define the human spirit. It's the intangible, immeasurable, ineffable, numinous reality that all of us need to have access to find meaning in life and to make life worth living. It's a deeply intuitive sense of relatedness or connectedness to all life, especially other people, to the world, and to the universe in which we live. The metaphysical, but not necessarily supernatural reality, which we need to experience to live fully human lives. So, I wasn't sure how you'd think about that, but I'll be interested to hear in the question period. So the next question, just to move on, is dignity connected with sacredness? And I believe that we need to enlist a concept of sacredness to protect and promote our human spirit. And I'll speak about what I mean by sacredness shortly. But here I want to ask, is dignity connected with it? It's been suggested it is. And that would mean that dignity is connected with protecting and promoting our human spirit. Now, again, Mylander says that in speaking about dignity, Leon Katz, I don't know whether any of you are familiar with his work, wonderful American physician, philosopher, ethicist, he starts with the concept of sanctity and moves from it to dignity, but Cass sees sanctity and dignity as closely interrelated, and similarly the late Father John Newhouse says the same thing, and David Gelantner suggests that in order to define dignity, we begin by looking up the word sacred. It seems to me, he says, that human dignity, as bioethics understands it, is actually a sanitized version of human sanctity and one that's been purified of all traces of religion. In bioethics, human dignity means implicitly that all humans are being set apart or dedicated to some higher purpose, regarded with or entitled to respect. British philosopher Roger Scruton provides another insight that's relevant to understanding the nature of dignity. He says that what's left out of contemporary standard treatments of ethics is the requirement to face the surrounding world with due reverence and humility, a disposition he calls piety. I agree with him, although what he calls piety, I'd call respect for the secular sacred. In my book, The Ethical Canary, that's a different book, I introduced a concept that I called the secular sacred. Actually, I did it as a throwaway line in giving a lecture, and all hell broke loose as a result. Everybody hated it. Secular people thought I was trying to impose religion on them, and that religion had no place in the public square or public policy, and religious people objected that I was denigrating the concept of the sacred. One of my students said to me, "You know, Professor Somerville, when you have everyone mad at you, you're probably onto something." So I further explored the concept in the following book, which was The Ethical Imagination. And so what I'm talking about here in talking about the secular sacred is I'm proposing that the sacred is not only a concept that applies in a religious or ritualized context, but also one that operates at a general societal or secular level. I'm proposing it as a concept that, among other outcomes, might also help us define some shared ethics, including in relation to what respect for human dignity requires, and that we can endorse this concept whether or not we're religious, and if we are religious, no matter which religion we follow. I believe that each of us needs to experience a complex interaction of knowing ourselves, relating to others, appreciating our place in the great web of all life, and seeing ourselves as part of the earth, the stars, the universe, and the cosmos. The acute and continuous awareness of such a mind-blowing web of relationships is what I've described to you already as the human spirit. In summary, I'm proposing that linking the secular and the sacred by adopting a concept of the secular sacred can help to unite everyone who accepts that some things are sacred, whether they see the sacred source as religious or purely natural or secular. If we accept the sacred, whether the religious sacred or the secular sacred, we will accept that certain aspects of life are sacrosanct. Not everything that could be done to life, in particular human life, may ethically be done to it, and certain moral and ethical principles that should be respected and should govern our conduct flow from that. For people who are not religious in the orthodox sense, the authentically sacred in the form of the secular sacred can be found in the essence of being human, the search for morality, exercising the power to fully become oneself, undertaking the search for meaning in life. The authentically sacred might also be experienced and as a result identified in a sense of wonder and awe. In fact, one of the things I'm most worried about is that I'm very deeply concerned that children are no longer being given a sense of wonder and awe. There was a story in there's a part of one of our newspapers where they publish little personal stories. And this teacher asked a group of 11-year-old children coming back from summer vacation to write an essay on something that they would have loved to have done during their summer vacation but didn't do. And this little girl wrote an essay about how the thing she'd most like to do was climb a tree and watch the sun go down in the evening. And she'd never done that. She'd never been in a field. She'd never walked across the grass or the meadow in the wild. And I think that this disconnection of our children from nature, it just really, really, really concerns me. You probably don't have that problem down here in the great land of Texas. And I sort of understand about that because I'm actually from the outback of Australia. And I know what that great mystery of that huge open land means. It's an extraordinary experience. But there's so many young people now in our big cities who have a layer of concrete between them and the earth and almost a layer of concrete over the top of them with all the buildings and that they live among. And it's awful. I just think we've got to do something about that. The sacred then requires that we respect the integrity of the elements that allow us to fully experience being fully human. In doing so, we protect that experience. Now, before anyone walks out, which I'm glad to see you haven't done, I hasten to assure you that I'm not rejecting or denigrating the religious sacred. I personally believe it exists and we need it. But we need to bring as many people as possible to some consensus on ethics. And I believe this idea of the secular sacred can help us to do that. I did a 1-hour debate about a month ago with the head of the Humanist Atheist Society of Canada, and I thought it was going to be a knockdown, drag-out brawl. It was being recorded for broadcast. And indeed, the amazing thing was that we agreed on everything except whether or not there was a God. So, it is very surprising how much agreement we can find if we go about it that way. And in considering whether a concept of the secular sacred could help to promote human dignity, an important question to ask is, what are our present ethical obligations to future generations? What must we regard as sacred and hold on trust for them in order not to leave them worse off than we are, or with less choices or options than we have? What do we owe them? What does an ethics of responsibility, as compared with an ethics of rights, require of us? And there was a very good talk this afternoon that was exactly along those lines. And another way to investigate the sacred is to explore what it's meant to protect. And I'd suggest our metaphysical reality, such as important shared values, is such an entity. For instance, parents' and children's bonds to one another, especially parents' unconditional love for their children, are often described as sacred. Accepting that would put limits on what we may ethically do with reproductive technologies, for example. Sacredness may also protect our physical reality, in particular that of our own bodies and that of the world around us, or what I would refer to as nature. The progression of science's ability to change the human body has been breathtakingly fast, starting with transplants and cosmetic surgery, moving on to creating chimeras, human-animal combinations, and cyborgs, human-machine combinations. For the people who promote and laud such developments, the natural essence of being human has no element of the sacred, and therefore contains nothing that must be protected and preserved through restricting what we can do in light of what we ought not to do in order to maintain the integrity of our humanness. I'll consider that further in a minute. Now, just here, this probably, Daniel Sulmazy will talk to you about this tomorrow, but what he does is sets out very brilliantly why just respect for autonomy and freedom is not enough to preserve human dignity, because it doesn't, as he says, it doesn't define the most fundamental goods that we think are important, and therefore it's Ruth Macklin's suggestion that was all we needed is poverty-stricken in terms of what we really need to protect if we're going to protect our humanness. And what I've concluded is that dignities like justice, often it's easier to identify what constitutes a violation of it than to define what it is. And that's probably why it's common to speak of something being below dignity, but we don't talk so much about something being dignified. It seems that there's two concepts of dignity: intrinsic dignity, which comes simply with being human. Again, we heard a definition of that in one of the sessions this afternoon. It's a status model. You have dignity simply because you're human. Extrinsic dignity is conferred dignity, and that which can be conferred can be taken away. It's a functional or achievement model. In other words, you are a human being and you have respect simply because you are a human being under intrinsic human dignity. You're a human doing, and once you can't be a doing anymore, you don't have any dignity under an extrinsic model. And those two definitions provide very different answers as to what respect for dignity requires. For example, human embryos are human beings, and therefore under a concept of intrinsic dignity, they must be respected. Human embryos are not yet human doings, therefore under a concept of extrinsic dignity, they don't require respect. Similarly, in the context of death and dying, or disabled people, Under inherent dignity, you're human, therefore you deserve respect. Under extrinsic dignity, you can't do the things that are required to be dignified, so therefore you don't have it. Dignity is relevant to bioethics, but it plays a kind of a ubiquitous and somewhat, as we can see because of this lack of agreement about what constitutes it, a fairly open role, would be the way that I would put it. Sometimes, we don't have things that are perfect, but the question we have to ask is, are we better off with it than without it? And certainly my conclusion is that we're better off with dignity than without it. I found these three ways of describing it useful. Human dignity as empowerment, and that says, well, that gives you the power to insist on respect for your autonomy and self-determination. Human dignity as constraint, that there's some things we ought not to do because to do them would be to infringe human dignity. That's the intrinsic dignity concept. And then a dignified conduct. And what I'd like to just quickly do is now to explore dignity in some specific cases in healthcare bioethics literature. And the first one that I chose is the sale of organs for transplantation, because dignity is a very dominant theme in this situation. I was fortunate to be in Istanbul about 18 months ago, and we have drafted, and it's now been accepted by World Health Organization, the Declaration of Istanbul on Organ Trafficking and Transplant Tourism. And what that's trying to do is to protect human dignity worldwide in the context of human transplantation. Dr. Francis Delmonico, who was formerly the president of the International Transplant Society and head of transplantation surgery at Harvard, was the leader in organizing this. And it was very interesting to listen to him, because what he said was that he felt that these breaches of human dignity, these breaches and abuse of human rights, were possible because of the technology that he'd tried to develop. And therefore he felt he had a responsibility when these abuses were obviously taking place to do something about it. And so to treat others just as a means is a failure to respect their dignity. To transport these very poor people from developing countries to other countries where their organs will be taken is to treat them as mere means, not as people in their own right. And so it's wrong at the level of the respect for the dignity of that individual person. But what's interesting about dignity is it's got to be respected in two ways. We have to have respect for each individual and each individual human life, but we also have to have respect for human life in general and humanity as a whole. And so that's a societal level analysis. And in fact, this trading in people, in bits of people, instead of as in the past with the horrors of slavery, we traded in whole people. I believe this is equally wrong. And what we can also say is that we're all dehumanized, not just the people who are abused in this way, if we treat the human body as merchandise. It was true that some of the American transplant surgeons got very angry with me because I was quite passionate about saying that I thought this should be stopped, and they felt that Dr. Delmonico had kind of lobbed me into this meeting as his sort of nasty little worm that was in there causing trouble for them. And one of the reasons that they were so upset was because you have private health care in the US, and these surgeons had, some of them at least, not all, this wasn't true of all of them by any means, but they had big empty operating rooms, and they couldn't earn any money because they could do the operations, but they could, and they had the patients who needed the organs, but they couldn't get the organs, and they were arguing that maybe it was okay therefore on strictly controlled conditions to allow some sale of organs. But it's interesting, and they also argued that the people, that they would have made incredibly sure that the people gave fully informed consent, which I'm sure they would have done. But there's a very interesting case out of France. The French dreamt up this sport called dwarf throwing. And what they would do is two big burly guys would get a little person who's achondroplastic, a dwarf, and they would start off quite close to each other and they'd throw the dwarf from one to the other, and the first person who dropped the dwarf lost the game. And anyway, some French people got very upset about this and went to court and said they wanted an injunction from the court to stop this, and the court gave the injunction and said yes, it was an affront to human dignity and disrespectful of humans to use a person as a ball in a game. And the dwarfs protested because they were earning lots of money out of this, and they said, but we've given our consent. And what the court held was that the consent did not legitimate something that offended human dignity in that way. So that's one of the really interesting things, that consent is often a necessary condition for something to be ethical, but it's not necessarily a sufficient condition. The other thing that's interesting about organs is that one of the arguments for not allowing sale is that it is an occasion for altruism, generosity, courage, concern, and care for others. And those are the characteristics that most manifest and implement and promote human dignity. Whereas if you make this a sale, a commercial transaction, you're doing exactly the opposite. And so that was not acceptable. The second area, because I'm sure I'm probably I'm getting some keen-eyed. In New Zealand we have keen-eyed sheepdogs, and they go like this. And Dr. Davis is giving me a keen-eyed sheepdog. Look. Anyway, that's okay. I'm used to it. Anyway, dignity and dying. The same thing comes up here. The pro-euthanasia advocates argue that what respect for dignity requires is the absence of suffering. And therefore they say, we will put you're suffering, we will respect your dignity, we will put you out of your undignified state by eliminating you. Whereas the opponents of euthanasia believe that respect for human dignity requires respect for human life, and that if there's a conflict, then human life has to take priority. It's also interesting, if you look at the history of dignity and the concept of access to health care, it was promoted as a way of saying that everybody had a right to a minimal level of health care, and if you didn't give them the health care they needed, that was an affront to their dignity. And now there's starting to be quite a strong argument, although pro-euthanasia people have always said this will never happen, that we need to have euthanasia to save resources. That is, to make sure these people don't use the resources that they would need. And I don't know whether you've had this in the States, but I got a copy of a letter from the Oregon Health Authority. Now, as you probably know, assisted suicide is legal in Oregon under certain conditions. And what this letter was about was that when people applied to the Oregon Health Authority for the funding of very expensive, probably almost certainly they would have been end-of-life cancer drugs, and these can be very expensive. When their request was turned down and the letter telling the person that they weren't going to pay, the authority wouldn't pay for the drug was sent to the person, in the letter it reminded the person that they had assisted suicide available at a very reasonable rate. I was really shocked by this, so that it is now, and we see that elsewhere, that the idea that it was, you would never talk about saving resources or money in connection with euthanasia. By the way, there's also just been several reports in the medical literature and also at medical conferences that there's been 4 cases in Belgium, for example, of euthanasia and then recovery of organs for transplantation after euthanasia, which I think also is extremely worrying. So one of the things is on this dignity and dying. This is one of my colleagues in Canada, an amazing guy. He's a psychiatrist of dying people. And what they did, they looked at the components that would make people feel that they were being treated with dignity and that they had dignity, and they evolved this dignity therapy that probably mightn't look very clear, but what they worked out was what you could do to actually treat somebody so that they could feel more respected and more dignified. And the results of this research were absolutely amazing. 91% of people said that it helped them feel better. They had significant improvement, reduced depressive symptoms, lessened sense of suffering, and increased will to live. So that, I would suggest to you, are the sorts of things that we need to do. Dignity and reproductive technologies is another one. For example, does enhancing an embryo improve its dignity? Most people in the same kind of views as I have say no, and even the secular people, for example, the famous German philosopher Jürgen Habermas says no. Indeed, he says that enhancing embryos goes to the nature of democracy, because the two principles on which democracy are founded are freedom, liberty, and equality. And he and Kierkegaard argue that if you've designed somebody, they're no longer free to make their lives for themselves. They can no longer be the authentic person that they create themselves. And also, if somebody's designed you, you're not equal to the person who designed you. So it undermines both liberty and equality, which are fundamental not just to people, but to our kind of society and our societal institutions. Nick Bostrom, who's a transhumanist in England, he says, it's good because the more you improve somebody, the more dignified they are. You see, again, that's the more you can do, the more dignified you are, and it's a status approach. Making human embryos for research or to make products, I believe that offends dignity. People talk about setting up human embryo manufacturing plants, where the embryos are actually the product that you use to make the other things that you want. And it's an objectification, reification, dehumanization. And here's what Habermas says. He says that respect for pre-personal human life is necessary to maintaining our ethical understanding of what it means to be human. There is a long-established, widely shared, deep moral intuition that human embryos are not just things or just cells like any other cell, as some argue, and we breach that intuition at our ethical peril. Now, I'm going to skip the rest from there because okay, so the new technoscience faces us with questions no humans before us have ever had to contemplate, which include, is there an essence of our humanness that we must hold on trust for future generations? Is respect for human dignity one way we can protect that essence and fulfill that trust? And do some utilitarians reject the concept of human dignity because it restricts what they want to do? Those questions raise an important new possibility, the use of science to search for human perfection and the issue of when that is a breach of human dignity. It's often said that nowhere are we more at ethical peril than when we undertake quests such as the search for human perfection through science. The Nazi horrors showed us the dangers of a political platform or public policy approach that uses science and technology to search for perceived biological perfection in ourselves individually and in a society as a whole. Today we can seek the perfect baby through designing it using genetic and reproductive technologies, positive eugenics, the perfect copy of ourself with cloning, the perfect war, risk-free to us with virtually controlled, disembodied combat technologies, the perfect athlete with drug use or gene doping, the perfect body with cosmetic surgery. Likewise, we can seek to eliminate those we see as imperfect, negative eugenics. We use new technology to carry out embryo biopsies, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis on in vitro fertilized embryos to identify and discard those who are, quote, defective. We use prenatal screening to identify fetuses with genetic or other disabilities such as Down syndrome and abort them. Over 90% of all babies in North America with Down syndrome are now aborted. We are wiping out the Down syndrome population, and we're going to be able to check for manic depressive genes, for all sorts of things. And most recently, we have a do-it-yourself test that can be used at 10 weeks of gestation to see if the baby is male or female, so that if we're having a baby of, quote, the wrong sex, we can abort it and, quote, try again. And in a context that's relevant to all of us, because we will all face death, we can seek both to achieve the perfect death and to eliminate imperfect people through euthanasia and assisted suicide. Equating human perfection with having human dignity and seeking human perfection as a way of enhancing human dignity opens up the possibility of justifying these kinds of intervention. Why does that matter? I want to propose that at least some, and perhaps many of these interventions in search of the perfect and to eliminate the imperfect threaten the essence of our humanness, our human spirit, that which makes us human and enables us to experience awe, wonder, and the mystery of life, and through which we search for meaning. This latter search is of the essence of being human. We are meaning-seeking beings, and as far as we know, uniquely so. Those who are religious define what constitutes the essence of our humanness as the soul, the sharing of in a divine spark. It's extremely difficult to define what constitutes that essence for those who reject religion, but such people believe, or at least act as though, such an essence exists. For instance, anybody who agrees that humans are special as compared with other living beings and therefore deserve special respect is manifesting such a belief. However, as I explained previously, some secular humanists expressly reject such a belief. They regard what they call as preferencing humans, seeing humans as special as compared with other animals or even robots, as wrongful discrimination in the form of what they call speciesism. I propose a very important question we need to ask in deciding what we may and should not do with our new technoscience, that is, what is ethical or unethical, is whether any given use of it to search for human perfection could damage or destroy the essence of our humanness. That leads to the question of whether at least some imperfections are elements of that essence and of immense value as such. I believe that if we succeed in our search for human perfection, or perhaps even if we just engage in it, we will lose our authenticity, our human essence, our messy, old, much-touched soul. We will be like copies of masterpieces or like restored antiques, not originals, no longer unique, no longer the real thing. In short, I'm suggesting that we need a deep respect for the natural if we are to respect human dignity. To implement that respect, I argue in my book, The Ethical Imagination, that in using the world-altering powers of the new technoscience, especially in relation to interventions on life itself, in particular in taking the decisions that will affect our children and their descendants down the generations, we should start from a basic presumption in favor of respecting nature, the natural, and life. This presumption could be described as seeing the natural, whether it is we humans or other animals or our ecosystem, as having a certain dignity, as expressing the order of creation, however we might believe that came about, and starting from a presumption of the need to respect that. That does not mean that nature, the natural, and life must not be altered. Rather, those altering them must justify doing so. It's a precautionary principle or approach. We must ask ourselves, what do we owe to future generations in terms of holding nature, the natural, and life in trust for them. Applying this approach in relation to what human dignity is and requires leads to the conclusion that we should adopt a concept that dignity should depend simply on being human, which means that all humans deserve respect and equal respect. The concept of dignity must be used to maintain respect for the integrity and authenticity of each person and respect for human life in general and for the essence of our humanness. The current danger, as I hope my various examples have shown you, is that it could be used to realize precisely the opposite outcomes. I would like to conclude by quoting physician and ethicist Dr. Edmund Pellegrino, who was the former chairman of the President's Council on Bioethics. And here I quote him: "Two contrary but not necessarily contradictory worldviews will dominate the discourse in our post-secular civilization. Two images of human dignity compete for moral authority. One is the scientific, the other the religious. Neither is likely to capitulate to the other. Is a productive dialogue and dialectic between these two worldviews possible, and how is it to be conducted? Extremists on both sides, militant atheists and intransigent dogmatists, insist there can be no common ground. More responsible proponents of both views hope for a productive dialogue and appeal to the necessity of a common ground in the public arena, even while metaphysical foundations remain disputed. That is what I am trying to do in some of the suggestions that I've made to you tonight. And may we engage in the necessary dialogue with courage, wisdom, and mutual respect. Thank you.
You're invited to ask questions. We ask you to come to the microphone so you can be heard. Especially in church, please. You ask questions if it comes to something.
You're scared.
I need some help. I'm sorry.
No questions? Yes.
Just one question. I enjoyed what you mentioned in relation to sickness.
I'm sorry, I'm going to have trouble hearing you from here. Is that working? Yeah.
Your comment earlier regarding the relationship with secular sacred, that we need to look at that. And then your conclusion here talking about nature and the natural. I have a question because, do you make any relationship between that secular sacred and natural law?
And natural-
That discussion which has been going on, and why not use natural law, which has a class that has been used throughout the centuries? I'd just like your opinion on it.
Yeah, I am a natural lawyer, but
Sense that.
but we've got to be very careful because we've got to be careful not to confuse things, that's for sure, and we often do that. But we also, I think, we have to try to find bridging language. And I sometimes get invited to groups of religious people who are sort of speak publicly in a more traditionally religious way. You know, they get up and they'll quote the Bible and whatever, and validly. But, you know, what I often ask them is, who are you trying to convince? Are you trying to convince each other, or are you trying to convince people who don't currently agree with you? And if you're trying to convince people who don't currently agree with you, you have to try to speak in a way that those other people can also join with you. And natural law, I mean, I respect it. It's what I, do a lot of work on. But the problem with that, with using that term in the context in which I'm speaking, I mean, if we're in an academic discussion, then yes, of course you'd use it. But in the context I'm speaking, immediately you'd say that, then what would happen in the audience is somebody who completely objects to having anything to do with natural law because they will associate that with the religions will get up and immediately protest that that's a religious base, therefore that's got no relevance in the public square, and you shouldn't, why should we have to listen to this? They would use the statement that you're trying to impose your religion on us and this is a secular society and you can't do that. So I modify the language not to be deceptive, and I'm not arguing from a religious base. I'm arguing from a secular base, regardless of what my own beliefs are. And that's what my book, The Ethical Imagination, is about. It was what my Massey lectures were about. It was, can we find a way where a lot more of us than at present can agree on a whole lot of things, whether or not we're religious, and if we're religious, what religious, no matter which religion we are.
In your response, I just said, have you found because I do understand what you're saying about people turning off natural law, but do you find that they are open to the sacred? You mentioned that you got that same response, so that's what I'm wondering.
Are they open to the secular sacred? Yes, well, much to my surprise, they are. That's what I found with this humanist the other day, that he liked the idea. Because the other thing I talk about as well sometimes is about a concept of secular religion, because what I would do is talk to them, for instance, about the environmental movement and point out to them about how a lot of the ways that they feel about that and what they want respected, and how they don't want this lake destroyed and they don't want the birds covered in oil and all that's really what we can all talk about, and we can all say, yes, we agree that we've got to have respect for this, and that therefore we should treat that as a secular sacred trust, and we can talk about holding it on trust for future generations and not ruining their world, etc. And there's a lot more that we can find we agree on than one would think when all you do is clash. Another sort of approach that I use, and again I write about this in the book, is I think we've made a huge mistake in always focusing on our disagreements and always starting from our disagreements. That I think what we need to try to do is find where we can agree and move to our disagreements, so that because when we find there's some things we can agree on, we have an experience of belonging to the same moral community. And that gives us a different tone and sort of ambience than if we're always just fighting and saying, we've got nothing in common with you. Because we have. I mean, for a start, we're all human. So...
Thank you for your talk. A comment and then a question. My comment is just referencing your point about worrying about the dignity of humans and treating humans like animals, and that being the question of the 21st century. My comment is I just don't think we need to sacrifice human dignity in terms of expanding the concept to non-human animals, especially in light of the fact of how terrible non-human animals are treated in our factory farms and the conspicuous absence of most Christians when it comes to those kinds of concerns. And my question is related to the comments. When we talked about dignity, or when we saw dignity used in your talk, it was almost exclusively human dignity. And pro-human dignity, that's one reason why I'm here, why I do what I do. But is it really necessarily human dignity that you're talking about? We recently discovered that there's a planet like ours just a few light years away. If we were to discover an alien species that was like us in every other relevant way except it didn't have human DNA, wouldn't we say that they had the same dignity as us? And if that's the case, is it really human dignity that we're talking about, or is it something else?
What I've been arguing for a very long time is that we have to have, I call it profound respect for all life, all life. And then I would argue that we have special respect for human life. But I think you're right that it's not just human dignity, but whether we use the word, what we can do is either keep the word dignity just to mean the special respect that we have for human life, and then say respect for life, for all life, or if we want to say that we give dignity to all life forms, then we've got to talk about special respect for human life. But I actually believe that if we don't start to have more respect, and not just for animal life, but plant life and our world, our ecosystem, that we will not be able to maintain respect for human life. I think it's essential, that pervading sense of the awesomeness of what we hold in our hands. I mean, in a way, we hold now, we're the first humans ever. Paul Davies says that he thinks that life on Earth came from Mars. Now, don't go off the deep end about this either. That it was possibly organisms in meteorites from Mars that crashed into the Earth, and that the extreme organisms on the underwater volcanoes that can exist at enormous temperatures and pressures might be the living descendants of those, and that happened about 4.8 billion years ago. Very, very, very long time. So one of the things that I sort of thought about in writing in a paper I was writing recently was the Ash Wednesday statement, remember man thou art but dust, and unto dust thou shalt return. Imagine if we changed that to remember man thou art stardust, and unto stardust you will return. The awesomeness, the wonder, the mystery of that, and therefore the mystery of all life on Earth. And I think it's that sense of mystery how we can't understand it, but we can perceive it, and that's what we get the sense of, that we need respect and dignity for life. And Matthew Scully's book called Dominion, I can only read a tiny bit of it. It's so horrible about what happens to animals. And this factory farming that we've got, I really think things like that, all of us have obligations to try to do something to stop that. I think it's appalling. But, we might get there one day.
He struggled with, how do we teach compassion in medical education, particularly medical school residents and here at Baylor in the undergraduate world, and he kind of responded to his talk through model. We model compassion, and that's how we teach future physicians. And I would kind of ask you to just reframe and pose that question: how can respect for dignity best be taught? Is it best be taught in the classroom through pedagogical methods, curriculum development? Can it be modeled? If so, how would you recommend it be modeled?
That's a question that's beyond my expertise. I mean, it's a very good question, but I think for most of these things, one of the things I think is back to the family, and what happens in the family is enormously important. I've been having a look at some experimental psychology literature recently for another reason, and two things that, very young children, like really sort of under a year old, apparently have some sense of right and wrong. So, which is interesting, and also the idea that we keep morally developing for quite a long time into our 20s is also, there's some research in that regard. So I think a lot of what we've done in the past has probably, we've been able to communicate these things, but we didn't really know how we were doing it. And then we started studying how do you do it. And I think what we do is we go from what I call a true simplicity stage, where very often we're doing things quite well, but we don't know why we're doing that. We just know it works. And then we go into this stage where we find out a lot more about it, and we go into a chaos phase, and we start thinking, oh, we don't understand what to do about this. And then I think what happens is that we structure the chaos, and we come out at what I call the apparent simplicity stage, where often what we decide we need to do is very like the true simplicity stage, but the difference is that we now understand why it works this way. So, I can't tell you how to do it, but one of the sayings that I like, and it consoles me a lot, it's a Japanese saying that says that as the radius of knowledge expands, the circumference of ignorance increases. So if you think about your knowledge as like a laser beam going out into the darkness of our unknowing, the further out we go, the more we know, the more that we know that we don't know. And I think that should make us very humble and cautious about what we do.
Had said that, and I'm just paraphrasing here, but speaking about intentionality, said that the most profound things and the possibilities of what can be can only be learned by watching someone else or receiving that in action.
Yeah. Well, there's this whole new field too of genetics called epigenetics, where they now know that certain environmental triggers actually are required to do what's called imprint genes, that is, activate the genes, and the genes actually physically change. Several of my colleagues at McGill are sort of world leaders in this area, so that when a baby rat is born, if the mother rat doesn't lick the baby rat within a very short period of time after the birth, that little baby rat, when it grows up, it won't be able to nurture its young because its genes for nurturing behaviour will not have been imprinted, and therefore it won't be capable of doing the nurturing behaviour. I was telling a very brilliant scientist friend of mine in Australia about this research, and he looked at me and said, "Margot, I'm an unlicked mouse." And but I think we're just learning so much. It's absolutely amazing.
I understand that from the way you define it, human spirits and secular sacred don't depend upon religion.
Uh-huh.
But what about God? Religion is something that we do and we believe. God is whomever God is. And so I'm wondering, do human spirit and secular sacred mean something different if God exists or if God doesn't? Or does it mean the same thing in either case?
I don't think it doesn't tell you one way or the other. And I think what it is, it's that you don't demand that somebody has to believe in God in order to think that it's important to treat some things as sacred, or in order to think that we all share a human spirit. We all have a human spirit. I don't know so much about share. There's a saying in Hinduism, which it's a very common Hindu salutation, which is Namaste. And the translation of Namaste is, the light in me recognizes the light in you. And I find that very beautiful, because I think for Christians it can be that the soul in me recognizes the soul in you. Or it can even be, I just did a speech on, we've just done a international declaration on the human right to pain management treatment. And in it we did that the pain in me recognizes the pain in you, because if you can get healthcare professionals to recognize the pain in their patients, that's the most important step in getting something done about relieving that pain. So, I think what we have to do is allow people to be at the level at which they can sort of participate. But the more that you can give them ways in which they can participate, I think the better it's going to be for all of us. And that's really all I'm trying to do. I'm just trying to not exclude people, for instance, by saying you're not religious, you don't believe in God, therefore you and I can't sort of share in any way. I think we've got to find ways that we can share whatever it is that we think is us as humans.
I recently read Ronald Dworkin's book called Life's Domain, and in that
Sorry,
book-
I can't hear you.
Is that better?
Yeah, that's much better.
Ronald Dworkin has a book called Life's Domain, and in that book he essentially argues that the value of human life comes not only from a natural a natural value that is inherent in people, but also a value that comes from the investment by ourselves and by others. So it's not exactly the same as the value that we claim people have, or that the more liberal idea human being people claim comes from activity. It's more like what all the people put into this person. And so he uses that idea to argue that abortion and euthanasia are often the right thing to do because the value instilled in a person other than their natural value, or outweighs their natural value, essentially. So I was wondering what your model or another model, how you would respond to that kind of claim other than the instilled value.
Well, Ronald Dworkin doesn't believe that humans have got any value beyond the temporal and the present. He does, and he does write in favour of euthanasia and abortion. All I can say is that my basic values system is such that it doesn't accommodate those things, and his basic values system is such that it does. And I don't know that you can go very much beyond that. I can't, I don't know if anybody else has got any thoughts on that, but I think there's a very fundamental, I personally believe, I think that euthanasia is the single most important question that we face. I'm very anti-euthanasia, and I'm not so much anti it because of individuals, but because of the harm it'll do to institutions and shared societal values. I think we're going to have an appalling situation. And if you want an example of it, all you have to do is look at what's happened in the Netherlands. Everybody says, well, it's only going to be used in rare cases, and it's for people suffering, etc. In the Netherlands, 30 years ago, to have euthanasia, you had to be terminally ill, in unrelievable suffering. You had to be competent. You had to give consent. You had to request over a period of time that you would have wanted euthanasia, and there was no other way to relieve your suffering. Now in the Netherlands, not one of those conditions applies. In the Netherlands now, you can have euthanasia of a disabled newborn baby. You can have euthanasia of children whose parents give consent as well as the child if they're 12 to 16. The courts upheld that a 55-year-old woman who was seriously depressed and her psychiatrist gave her a lethal injection, that was valid euthanasia. And most recently, just in the last few weeks, the Dutch have a process like California does, where you can have legislation by the people, and they had to get 40,000 signatures for a petition that anybody over the age of 70 who was, quote, tired of life had a right to have euthanasia. And they got 100,000 signatures in 10 days. And so that petition is now in the Dutch Parliament. So, you just can't hold the line. And so my argument, I happen to think euthanasia is wrong because I think it's wrong to kill another person. But my arguments against euthanasia are that once you've legalised it, you can't control it, and what it will do at the societal level to medicine, it changes medicine, it changes law, and it undermines all of the values that we've had for thousands of years. And the really big question about euthanasia is, Why now? There's nothing new about euthanasia. We've always got sick, we've got old, we've been terminally ill, we were suffering, and somebody could have killed us. So why suddenly now do we think it's a good idea? And that's another speech.
You began your talk with the problem of contemporary pluralism, and Charles Taylor and others have talked about the fact that pluralism kind of threatens to submerge us as one concept. This problem of how do we find our moorings? And you rightly talked about the rhetoric of involving as many people as we can in a wider moral community. However, I've got a concern I'd like you to respond to, and that is, I noticed that the language that you used in talking about what we do in this moral conversation that we have, this language of experience, of consensus, of a sense of the sacred. And I worry because all of that sounds extremely subjective. And in a way, my comment bounces off the earlier question about natural law. I understand why, for rhetorical reasons, we have to be careful about invoking natural law. The problem, however, seems to be if we base a concept of dignity on subjective senses or subjective perceptions or an experience that we hope that some people will have, it's inherently unstable. And all it requires is a sufficiently powerful political regime or sufficiently powerful pragmatic considerations. And under circumstances like that, any concept of dignity will simply be washed away.
Yeah, it's a valid criticism, although I'm not nearly as nervous of subjective stuff as some people are. In fact, I believe that most of our decision-making is, it's not reason, it's not logical cognitive reasoning. I believe that reasoning is a secondary verification mechanism for decisions that we make. And so I would still try to bring that in. You see, the other thing I talk a lot about is, especially in the book, is that I'm not proposing disjunctive approaches. I'm proposing conjunctive approaches. And so we still need the objective rationale and discussion and analysis. But you know, in putting taking some of the emphasis onto the subjective, there's a danger in it, as there is in everything. Although I think one of the other things, there's some research being published in Nature that looked at people with damage to the emotional centers of their brains. And what was extremely interesting was that those people could not make good moral, ethical decisions. And as well, there's another research study on the cognitive frontal lobe functioning. And people with problems with the frontal lobe made what the researchers called overly utilitarian decisions. So some of the bioethicists I agree with, I was wondering, I wondered if they had some sort of frontal lobe stuff. But anyway, I won't suggest that. That'd be really mean. But yes, you're right. And I think the other thing that's important about what you do in doing that is to always to be aware of what the dangers are of the ways that we propose to go about things. And you've got this situation in Germany at the moment with Angela Merkel saying, well, it's impossible, we can't do it. But sometimes you have to think, well, even if there's a saying about psychoanalysis, that psychoanalysis is an impossible profession, and sometimes it's more difficult than others. And I think that's a bit somehow the situation that we can sometimes be in. We can feel that it's impossible, but we still have to try. And it's a matter of making a value judgment. Are we better to stick to what we believe, to be adamant about it, to say unless you accept all of the things that we think you have to believe, we can't function with you? Or is it better to do what I'm doing? I mean, a lot of people criticize me and say, no, this is diluting things, this is wrecking things, and all I can do is put out there what I think, and it's up to other people to decide what they think about it.
You observed that
autonomy and dignity can be in conflict. What's the paradigm in your mind for resolving that? More significantly, what role does the legal system play in a pluralistic society for deciding which one of those trumps the other in a variety of situations?
Well, if you equate autonomy to dignity, then of course they're almost always be in conflict if you're not going to let the person do what they want to do. It would be more that the dignity of the individual, and especially if that's connected with autonomy, could be in conflict with the dignity of humans in general. I mean, that's really what that dwarf example showed, because those dwarfs gave their consent. They wanted to participate in this, and the court said no, because you're denigrating human life in general and you can't do that. So they can be in conflict. As to the law, you know, what we've done with charters of rights is, and particularly in Canada, we've got a lot of conflict at the moment because the charters of rights are being used by people who've got very liberal values to attack people with conservative values, and they're not content that the liberal values people are not content to do what they want to do. They want to force the people who think that's wrong to do what they want them to do. And so we've had lots of cases in our human rights courts and tribunals, and lots of challenges under the Canadian Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms. And the courts are pretty liberal. And, you know, there's sort of a statement, sort of a feeling at the moment that the courts are our highest, sometimes we say our highest cathedrals and churches, because they're ruling on what are essentially moral questions that would have once been ruled on by the churches. So it's a tough scene. Thank you.